2019, my father passed away. He had heart issues since birth and eventually died from a heart attack. Being an only child, this crushed me. My father was one of my best friends and someone that I always looked up to. Before my father passed, he had given me his pocket knife. Now, this was not some kind of ordinary pocket knife. This was a pocket knife my father's father had made from scratch and has been handed down ever since. This was my father's final gift to me before he passed on. His funeral was on a sunny Friday afternoon. There were many who attended. Just as my father's casket was about to be lowered into the ground, I pulled out the pocket knife and laid it on top of the casket. I know my father had given it to me as a gift, but I wanted him to be buried with it. They lowered the casket and filled it with dirt. My spirits were low that day. If I'm being honest, I was completely depressed. The funeral ended and everyone went back home. My wife tried to cheer me up with food, but I was too upset to have any joy. Once I got home, I went to bed and tried to sleep. I did sleep, and for a long time, but around 2 in the morning that same day of the funeral, I was awoken by loud knocking. My wife and I woke up at the same time, startled by how loud the knocking was, especially at this hour. I told her to stay in bed while I go see. The knocking sound was violent, as if someone was trying to burst through our front door. I looked out the front window, being cautious before I opened the door. But when I looked out, my front porch was empty. No one. I thought maybe it was kids playing a prank, but the banging on the front door was too heavy to be children. After about 5 minutes of looking out my window for any type of movement, I decided to open my front door. It was cold, and not a soul was in sight. I grumpily went to close my front door when I saw something glimmering at my feet. I looked down. What I saw was impossible. There, laying on my porch rug, was a pocket knife, but not just any pocket knife. My father's pocket knife. The pocket knife that was buried with him. I reached down and grabbed it with shaking hands. It was covered with fresh dirt. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. It was impossible. It was simply impossible for this to be here right now. I wanted this to be a joke, and I really did. I yelled out for whoever was out there to show themselves. No one did. I wish this story had a better conclusion. I wish I could give you a logical explanation as to how this happened. But to this day, my wife and I have no clue how my father's buried pocket knife ended up at our front porch at 2 in the morning. And I don't think we ever will. Not in this lifetime, anyway. Tragedy often strikes us when we least expect it. My girlfriend Rebecca was killed suddenly in a car accident driving home from work. It was one of the worst phone calls that I ever received. She was loved by her family, and of course by me. We actually had just celebrated our 3-year anniversary a week before she passed. The whole situation was heavy on my heart, and to this day, I still have trouble processing it. But the story that I'm telling you actually starts on the day of Rebecca's funeral. It was on a Sunday in June. It was hot outside, and over 200 people had attended. When the funeral service had finished, I ended up staying at her graveside well after everyone had already left. I did not want to leave her yet, and just sat with her at her grave. I spoke to her. I know she was not here anymore, but I was talking to her spirit. I was telling her how everything was going on down here, and how everyone misses her. I was in the middle of telling her how much everyone loved her when my phone started ringing. I reached into my pocket. I looked at who was calling me, but I did not believe it. It could not be. But there it was, across my phone screen. It was Rebecca. Rebecca was calling me. But how? Her number had been disabled and disconnected. Her phone is at her parents' house, but it has no service. There was no way Rebecca's name should be popping up on my phone right now. And I hesitated to answer it because something felt extremely ominous, like when you can feel the air changing right before a massive thunderstorm. My mind was screaming not to answer it, but the little curious voice we all have that just needs to explore was louder. I answered the phone. Hello? There was a loud whooshing sound in the receiver, almost as if someone was holding the phone out of the window of a speeding car. Flabbergasted, I was about to hang up when I heard a voice. It was not the voice of Rebecca, however. It was a male's voice. It sounded old, but what was even stranger was that the voice was speaking another language, a language that I did not recognize, almost as if they were speaking in tongues. Then the line went dead. A dial tone buzzed in my ear. Confused, I redialed the number, but the line said that the number you're trying to reach is no longer available. I stared in utter horror at my phone, not understanding the impossibility that just happened. And I called back again and again and again, and every time it said the number was no longer available. And I started to tear up because I did not know if I was experiencing some kind of supernatural phenomenon or just a horrible prank. But it had to be a prank, right? This sort of stuff is for urban legends and horror stories. This does not happen in real life. It's just a prank, right? I was the pastor for a small local church called St. Thomas Parish. In fact, next November will be my 10th anniversary of officially taking over as head pastor. It has been a rewarding journey so far, and I thoroughly enjoy my position. But in all my 10 years of ministering, only one time did I ever consider stepping down. It was my first year as head pastor, when I was asked to perform my first funeral. It was for an elderly lady named Cynthia. She was a regular church member, and her loss was heart-wrenching. It was a Friday when I conducted the funeral. There was about 50 people who attended. It was performed behind the church where the tiny cemetery is attached to the side, and I was giving my final blessing over Cynthia's casket when I noticed on the other side of the small cemetery a man standing alone. He had on a black trench coat and a black beanie hat. He was also wearing dark sunglasses, and I figured he was part of the funeral, but wanted to keep his distance. That was the only thought that I gave him. I finished giving the blessing, and the casket was beginning to descend into the ground. But just as it was about to be lowered, there was panicky screams all around. There was a man who had barged to the front of the casket and opened it up. Terrified screams rang throughout the cemetery as the man who had opened up the casket now had a gun drawn, and he was pointing it at the people. I quickly realized that the person holding the gun was the man whom I saw standing alone just 30 seconds ago. The man yanked off the necklace and bracelet that Cynthia was about to be buried with. He swung the gun around at the crowd and said that if anyone tries to follow him, there will be another funeral to attend. And then he was gone, sprinting across the cemetery and into the surrounding woods. I could not believe what just happened. I was dumbfounded. We ended up calling the police and the paramedics. Some of the older people who had attended had fainted and had chest problems because of the robbery. A few weeks after this happened, one of the head detectives who was handling the case stopped by the church. The detective informed me that the jewelry that was stolen off of Cynthia had a monetary value of about $250,000. Apparently, the guy who committed the theft knew she was going to be buried with that amount and plotted to rob the funeral. And it was all over the papers and news in our local county. And I regretfully have to inform you that no one was ever caught for the crime. To think, out of all the places to be a victim of a crime, I would have to think attending a funeral would not be one of them. But we do live in a crazy world.